Welcome to the Holistic Psychiatrist Podcast, a place for inspiration, insight, and information on holistic mental health. Join your host, Dr. Alice Lee, and discover critical information on safe, effective psychiatric medication withdrawal. Explore new ideas that enlighten and expand the mind with cutting-edge authors and experts, along with former patients as they share their miraculous healing journeys. It's time to build your well-being from the thought up. It's time for the Holistic Psychiatrist Podcast. Here's your host, Dr. Alice Lee.
Hello, and welcome to the Holistic Psychiatrist Podcast, where building well-being from the thought up creates miraculous healing journeys. I'm your host, Dr. Alice Lee, the holistic psychiatrist practicing in Lehigh, Utah. Today, I'm happy to introduce to you my guest, Kiki. Between 1996 to 2009, Kiki was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and prescribed 49 different medications, sometimes taking 9 at a time. She was able to wean off these medications prior to her holistic treatment with me in 2020. Over the past 3 years, Kiki and I have worked on 2 separate occasions to continue her healing process. She shares her challenges today associated with having a very high IQ, experiencing numerous types of abuses, and creating her own way in life despite being queer. How did she heal along the way and where is she headed? Listen to her amazing journey as she evolves from her stressful state of isolation to finding her groove in the world. I'm going to start with my first question, which is to just share a little bit about yourself. Tell us who you are.
Well, my artist name is Kiki LaFay. I use all pronouns. I was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota, but I grew up on a river in western Wisconsin. I had a lot of horrific things happen to me, but I had a kind of idyllic childhood too, playing in the forest and being outside. I'm 42 years old. I am on sabbatical right now, but I worked as a data analyst in healthcare for 10 years. And then I'm a musician, teaching artist, and on the board of directors of a music technology nonprofit that I co-founded.
How did you end up on medications in the first place? What symptoms did you struggle with at that time, and what caused your symptoms?
Initially, I was put on medication for acting out, like dissenting against my Baptist and evangelical Christian upbringing was a big part of it. I lost my religion around that time and really just didn't know, with everything I've been taught, what still worked for me and what didn't. So I was thinking about it, like what caused it. I think it was complex. I think some of it is a sensory processing disorder. Some of it is I do not react well to some kinds of medication, like especially antidepressants, that probably caused a lot of the bipolar symptoms. Probably some of it's genetic, not being able to process B vitamins well, having other viruses. So I think it's complicated, but I think the main root cause was just coming of age in a violent world and not being able to see a future life for myself within the communities I was raised in.
Like most mental health issues, I think you came across those stressors from multiple different areas, and all of these different medications were being used to kind of control what they thought was behavioral problems at the time. What medications did they put you on? How did they help or harm you?
Well, some of it was also, I was put into queer conversion therapy, which is one-on-one with my pastor. At the same time, I was put on some medications. And so I do think there was some element of coercion around it too, because like back then, queerness was not fully erased from the DSM. I mean, it's still not now, but this was like the late 90s. And so, I mean, there were some advantages of it. Sometimes I really needed the stability, especially some of the mood stabilizers. I never had a problem with benzodiazepines myself. So like in a crisis, those could be helpful. But I had so many negative effects, and some antidepressants would make me psychotic, problems with my metabolism, just feeling dumbed down. Like I couldn't read when I was on Abilify. And then lithium, I was on so much, even though I was taking it with a doctor, that I just keeled down on work, keeled down on the floor and work one day from too high of a dose of lithium. And I also got a tumor from it that was benign.
Wow, that's interesting. You said that some of the medications did help you. but some of them actually cause some of the mood swings that led them to diagnose you with bipolar disorder.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes these types of diagnoses arise from side effects from medications.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, my psychiatrist that I worked with in Madison, Dr. Ruth Sheldon, said that I never had bipolar, that she would call it bipolar 3, and she saw it all the time, that it was those kind of like manic mood swings caused from people taking antidepressants. And so she was the psychiatrist who helped me go off of all of my meds basically by 2010.
I'm
Mhm.
curious how that worked for you when she took you off those meds, because
Mhm.
I have, a whole kind of protocol that allows that to be done in a way that I hope is as safe as possible. But was she a conventional psychiatrist that did that for you?
She was not conventional, but she was more conventional than you.
Okay.
She was into Jung and psychoanalysis. So I think she was one of the only psychiatrists who was capable of seeing me as a person. And so she also did psychoanalysis and therapy for me. And then she did really help me taper off things, but she wasn't as knowledgeable as other things, especially with taking supplements that would ease things like you are.
So how did it go for you that first time when you went off those meds?
Before I met her, I had a really hard time going off my medication and was even hospitalized, trying to do it too quickly, or there wasn't good information out there. But with her, it really helped. I just had external things going on. Like I was involved in the Icarus project at that time, and I was on the cover of the Alt Weekly newspaper in Madison talking about going off my meds with a doctor's basically like permission and supervision. But I was working as a contract specialist in healthcare at that time, and I got fired for even, it was considered so subversive even talking about it.
Wow, that's really difficult. So you got off the
Mm-hmm.
medication, and then we started working in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
What caused you to decide to work from a holistic perspective?
I lost respect for mainstream psychiatry like a long time ago. I don't know how many psychiatrists I've seen over the years. It's probably been like 2 dozen. And there's very few that have treated me like a person. So I know it just doesn't work. It seems like a lot of it has made things worse. And then I mentioned before the DSM, it doesn't have a great history of being respectful to queerness, and even homosexuality was pathologized in the DSM too. So those aren't marks in its favor
Mhm.
from my perspective. And so I think like part of it for me to feel better was looking at it holistically myself. And I've been learning about energy medicine since I was a teenager. So it just feels like a much better fit for me.
Yeah, that's great. And you mentioned a couple of times now that it was important for you to work with someone who saw you as a person.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that allows us to go into the subject of how social stigma, how
Mm-hmm.
people perceive all of the different rainbow of sexual orientation has an impact on the person's identity, development, and even mental health. Can you help us understand a little bit more about that from your perspective?
Yeah, I think in some ways I would just be a completely different person if I had grown up in like a supportive environment around that. Like, I have another queer friend who told me that his family was just completely accepting when he came out, and there's never been any issues with them. In fact, the issue with them is they think that they know so much about it, that they're so supportive that they don't have anything else to learn, which they still do.
Oh, wow.
But for me, it's been the opposite, where there really has not been a lot of support from my family, and I'm estranged from a lot of my family because of it. So it's just really difficult. I think about my nibbling, being able to go to a school where there's little trans kids in kindergarten, and there's lots of kids that are out to be queer and it's not a big deal, and that they have different kind of accommodations for neurodivergence. Like their motto is like, we love quirky kids. Like I just wonder who I would be like if who I'd be now if I had that support. Not that I don't like who I am now, but that so much of my life has been against kind of like struggling around this and trying to carve out a space for myself. It makes me really happy to see some of the next generation not having as many problems as I did.
Well, I think that's a mild way of putting it because I know that it's such a very, very difficult fundamental wound to our sense of identity to be categorized and immediately labeled and oftentimes dismissed because of who we are, our nature. I wondered if you could share how that's impacted you, for example, at school or at work. I know that you've talked a lot about how it affected your friends and the losses that you've
Mm-hmm.
had to experience of your friends who were really socially impacted negatively because of the discrimination that's out there.
Yeah, well, and I mean, even though I think we've made a lot of progress, I think things are really scary and really vary by what place people are in right now too. In some places it's not better, like some places it's worse, but I've seen a lot of progress. I said I'm 42, and most of my queer friends that I knew when I was younger are either dead or like lost in some way, usually to drugs. My last job, I had a lot of issues with my boss around just kind of basic respect things and queer literacy. So it does impact how I just can engage in the world on a daily basis, and I just don't feel comfortable being myself everywhere either. Like I just realized that I'm part of a minority group, and sometimes I can't always be myself or speak my mind for my own protection.
Thanks for sharing that. And I know back in 2020, when we
Mhm.
first started working together, that was exacerbated and
Mhm.
magnified in terms of the COVID situation, so that the social isolation that you experienced was even more intense.
Mhm.
And that was when we first started meeting and talking about all of the stressors that came along with COVID.
Mhm. Yeah, and one of my radical mental health friends actually died of COVID isolation. That was like the highlight of 2020 for me, was going to his funeral in
Hmm.
Madison, which was like outside, and I hadn't like traveled or like been anywhere or anything like that. But he basically died of a broken heart. Like it was too hard for him not being able to do all the things that he loved and see the people that he could. So it was hard for a lot of us, and I don't think there's a lot of space for grief in the United States. I don't think we've grieved COVID as a collective trauma or a mass disabling event. I think that's something that we're still carrying with us collectively, but I have tried to work on through my music. I've been only really working on one song for the last couple of years, and it's called A Requiem for Life, and it has a lot of ideas in it, but one part of it is a reimagining of Mozart's Requiem, thinking and mourning, kind of living in a death cult, like where we don't honor life and where we just steamroll over everything and move on. And I think we're gonna have a big reckoning with our grief here someday.
Indeed, so much of it is intellectualized
Mm-hmm.
and statistics are quoted, but the actual difficulties, I think it's very hard for people to focus on and even describe
Mm-hmm.
that intense loss. So, when you started the holistic healing journey with me, what were some of the goals that you had for healing? And how did the healing process work for you physically and emotionally? That is, what kind of interventions started working for you? So let's start with what your initial goals were for healing when we first started working together and what interventions made a difference. Because at the time, I think you were having some difficulties with sleep. You were on Seroquel, which is an antipsychotic, at 100 milligrams at night. One of our goals was to help you to lower an antipsychotic and still be able to have good sleep.
Yeah, so during the uprisings in Minneapolis in 2020, I met with a psychiatric nurse online who misdiagnosed me with bipolar 2 again and gave me some medications, but it also brought up a lot of the past, basically like trauma that I had within the psychiatric industry in general, I guess. And so my goals were to go off Seroquel, but I think, like, working with you also just kinda healed some of that, like, psychiatric trauma too, because like, you're a psychiatrist that I actually trust.
Hmm.
So I didn't really have huge goals besides to see what neurological improvements could happen, because I was having a lot of issues with memory, with, like, motor function. I've had other like physical injuries and neuropathy. So I've been working in physical therapy for like years too, to even like move like one of my scapula and my fingers and stuff like that. So some of it was just to see like what could be healed beyond going off my medication again.
Yeah, during our treatment, you shared that at times you would faint.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and we talked even about having seizures, which could be potentially caused from taking mood stabilizers. So there's just a lot going on with me. Lyme's disease. I have a whole list of have a whole list of things, and they're all invisible. I think too. I look pretty happy and healthy, so a lot of people are surprised when they find out that I have chronic pain and health conditions, even though it's managed pretty well now.
Some of the tools that we used were supplements
Mhm,
and energy medicine techniques, or even addressing environmental
mhm,
stressors. Especially the second time you came in,
mhm,
there were a lot of stress at work
mhm.
where you felt like you had to leave work for a period of time because of some conflicts at work. And so the second time you came in, you really were serious about addressing
Mhm,
traumas and
mhm,
how some of the work related stressors were triggering
mhm.
past traumas. So, can you describe a little bit about how these interventions were kind of integrated for you, and whether they worked or what made them work for you?
I think it was really complicated because my employer was the health insurance company paying for some of this medication and treatment back when I was younger, and it was forced. So it was just like a very complicated thing. And I was really stuck there. There was some good things about it, but I feel like in situations where things have been positive in the past, I'll just put an infinite amount of energy into trying to fix them or trying to get them to go back to that.
Mhm.
And I think that's something I've learned in the last few years is just not forcing things to be something that they're not.
Mhm.
It was, like, pretty holistic too, like, I feel like taking the supplements help, doing the energy breaths help, making the smoothies help, like, doing the anti-inflammatory stuff helps, doing my PT and my pain management stuff helps, doing my swimming helps, like, my therapist, Elena, says I take the best self-care of anyone she's ever met, including other therapists, but I'm like, it all stacks together. Like, a lot of medical professionals, like, even the naturopath that I just saw for Lyme, when they hear, like, my medical history, they're just like, I'm happy that you're still alive, or I'm happy that you're still doing so well with everything that's happened to me so far.
Well, I know that people listening to this podcast don't see your face, but you're always smiling as you're talking. So it's a wonderful place for you to be at, where you can actually face the world. There's such a positive, radiant smile. So in the course of our treatment, we did a lot of trauma work with Empower Energy technique,
Mhm,
which I feel has been really good at targeting certain shifts and changes and beliefs. And I know for a while you try to make things work by either trying to improve the situation at work when you went back to work,
mhm.
or looking for a different job. But can you share what has happened in terms of your resolution of the challenges at work and some of the plans going forward?
Yeah, so I had been looking for another job, but I had some great lawyers at Gender Justice, so they were able to resolve the situation for me so I don't have to find another job immediately. And so that's why I'm able to go on sabbatical right now. And I've been taking this really fun road trip across the United States. I think for the entire month of July. I was in California last week. Now I'm in Utah at Dr. Lee's lovely Lehigh Rose Garden view. And then, like, I'm going to be moving to Guatemala in August and working with some mind friends who are starting an NGO there. And I want to start my own business. I already have an LLC doing some product design. So I just have like an opportunity to live somewhere else. There's a lot of great things about Minnesota, and I have a lot of friends there that I love, but winters are not great for me or my mental health. So I'm just excited that I have a chance to do something else, and I just don't have to work in an office or as a data analyst or product manager for a while. So that's exciting.
Yeah, it takes a lot of courage to shift directions and move to a different country and start building up a whole business from
Hmm.
scratch. So That's a really amazing thing that you're in the process of creating in your life. But before coming here, I know you went to a conference. It's called Mad Camp, and wanted to ask you about that. And hopefully, you can share some things about what happened there and why it was important for you to attend it.
Yeah, so I went to the first ever MAD camp, and it was really important for me to attend because I used to do radical mental health work with the Icarus Project for many years, including being on the coordinator collective for them. And Will Hall was one of the organizers for that, and I hadn't seen him, I think, like in 12 years. And so, even though Icarus Project itself is kind of like a mixed bag, it's called the Fireweed Collective now, and they do a lot of rad stuff. I still have like really good memories of working with Will and connecting with that community. So, in a way, it was kind of like coming home. I've also been involved in this clinic for psychiatric survivors that was really healing. But I think what was important to me was it was beautiful. It was in the mountains by Mount St. Helena. There were 40 people there, and there was some programming, but it really was like camp a lot. And they're inspired by Crip Camp. I used to be involved at another disability camp called Camp Courage for many years, and another production camp called Camp Spinoff for many years. And so I just love camps. And I love that there's one created for mad people who honor some of our visionary experiences instead of pathologize them. And they also had this amazing swimming pool there that you could look at the stars, and there were trees, and it was filled with spring water. The food was really good. Like usually at camp, it's not. But they'd have a lot of different workshops every day, and it was pretty loosey goosey for a conference. Like it is very fun and creative and unpredictable. And I am going to go next year for sure. I just really like connecting with people. There was people from all over the world, but there was a lot of people from the Bay Area, and just hearing about some of their community and connection there was really cool.
Yeah, wonderful. For those people who don't know much about the Icarus Project, can you talk a little bit more about what that project is all about?
The Icarus Project was a radical mental health group that was around, I think, from 2003 maybe until 2018 when it became Fireweed Collective. And there were local groups all over, but it was a way of creating a new culture and language around madness, and also looking at some kinds of madness as a gift, and how in other cultures, like prior to colonialization, people would be considered maybe going through a spiritual or religious kind of experience, or be a spiritual leader in their community, especially in animistic cultures. So it was about really telling people that they weren't alone, but then doing like creative, easy community building, just all across the world for a long time.
That's interesting. And I have had the opportunity to listen to some speakers at conferences who try to help the attendees understand that there's more to some of these mental health diagnosed conditions than just a medical perspective, and to be able to appreciate both the spiritual and potential benefits from that.
They also had something you might like, because one of the zines that I did lots of workshops on was called Friends Make the Best Medicine. So that was one kind of like one of the core values, is that like isolation isn't good for anyone, and that we need one another to survive. And sometimes like a friend is better than like any pill you can pop.
I was curious how you're feeling now, if you can share where you are right now in your journey of healing and what you've been able to accomplish now that you never thought possible before.
Yes, I've been feeling great. Like I said, I'm on this road trip. So that's been really fun. I've been doing everything, going to the top of Mount Lemon in Arizona, where there's different like ecosystems and plants and animals at every elevation, to like swimming in the Pacific and having a photo shoot in Malibu and going to this mad camp. Like I've just been on adventures. It's been great. But one thing that I wouldn't have been able to do is driving, with all of like my physical and neurological and emotional stuff going on when I was working with you. I don't think I was driving myself very much, if at all. I think my friend was. And that's been something that I struggle with when I have a lot of stress. And so even just being able to take this road trip from Minnesota to the West Coast and drive so many thousands of miles by myself. It has been something I didn't think I would be able to do.
Wow. Yeah, thousands of miles and having a good time at it too. So, in conclusion, I wanted to have you share, if you would, some advice to those people who are considering holistic healing, whether it's holistic healing from trauma or social isolation or stigma, and also for those people who feel that they've been medicated for situations that were arising from stressors in their environment. Since you've experienced so much of that in your life, would you share some words of wisdom for these individuals?
Yeah, I don't think there's another way to do it without looking at the whole. Like, I think like holistic is the way through because we don't live in a vacuum and we can't really isolate any of these things. So I think it is the one lens that I know that works. And maybe there's other ways to do it too. And I think like recently, in the last year or two, working with you, Dr. Lee, I've just been really thinking about our environment and how much more it can change us than we can change it sometimes. And just being really mindful of like where I am, what I'm surrounding myself with, and of course, like my own energy, but just realizing how much of a cost it can take to try to change something around me versus looking for places and people and things that are already aligned and appreciate me as is.
Yeah, I think that that's a really important message that sometimes we blame ourselves or even think that the problems from our sadness or suffering comes from within,
Mm-hmm.
which is more of a psychiatric or psychoanalytic perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very important, I think, just as you learned, to find social supports and social environments that affirm who we are and allow us to thrive and grow,
Mm-hmm.
right? Rather than try to change us or deny
Mm-hmm.
our inner essence. So I think that that's a really important message. And from a conventional psychiatry perspective, it's always medication.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we misunderstand that a person's suffering isn't coming from a biochemical source, but that if we can support that person in terms of social supports, help them get out of a toxic environment,
Mm-hmm.
that the symptoms will resolve on their
Mm-hmm.
own. Well, I wanted to really thank you for this time that you have given to be here on the podcast. I really appreciate it. And I hope that you'll have a really great time moving forward in your life as you move on to Guatemala.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lee.
So I think that today's podcast is really important to me, and I hope will be helpful for you because I've grown a lot from working with Kiki. I feel like I've learned a lot about how social acceptance or rejection can have deep mental health and emotional impacts, and how important it is for us to support each other, be compassionate, and open and tolerant to all the different ways that we can be as human beings. Everything, including my podcast and social media connections, are on my website, holistickpsychiatrist.com. I hope you really enjoyed this podcast as I have. Please share it with others. Please subscribe to this podcast so that you can get more informative insights in the future. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to my holistic updates, which come out every few weeks. And for those of you who are interested in obtaining professional grade supplements, you can register for FullScript, which is an online dispensary on my website under the products tab. You can register for them and be able to access high quality nutritional supplements that can be very, very helpful for physical recovery and mental health recovery. Until next time, let's keep building our well-being from the thought up and have a wonderful, joyful week. Take care and bye-bye.
The content provided by this podcast is for informational purposes only and has not been approved by the US FDA. This podcast is not intended to provide personal medical advice, which should be obtained from a medical professional.